Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for the next episode of our Learn Live Security 101 series, Identity and Access Management and Network Security Fundamentals. My name's Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to review our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer live. Our session is being recorded. It will be available to view on demand right here on the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our presenter. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, hello again, and thanks for joining me. So let's crack on with our Security 101. So this week, we're going to be talking about identity and access management and some network security fundamentals. Now, as always, this is an overview session, of course, in 45 minutes or so. I'm not going to be able to go through absolutely everything absolutely everything that we could possibly talk about, but hopefully this will give you a bit of an intro. You can go on our MS Learn platform and on our GitHub repo to read more about the Security 101 and then find some further learning as well. So the idea of this, if you didn't join me last week, just for a quick recap, is that we're just going to introduce you to some key concepts. It's not supposed to be comprehensive, but you can go read up more about it. I do have my eyes on the chat. I can see the questions. If you were here last week, well, I'm now at home. I wasn't last week. I have lots of screens, so I can see your questions. So please feel free to ask as we go along. I will try and answer them. I'll stop and answer them, or I'll get to them at the end. So this is what we are talking about today. We're going to talk about IAM or identity access management key concepts. We'll talk about identity and access management zero trust architecture. We touched on zero trust last week. We'll talk about capabilities. When we get to capabilities, I'll tell you what I mean. We're talking about tooling, but I'm not going to name any particular products apart from for examples, because at this sort of fundamental conceptual level, we don't need to talk about a specific tool. There are many tools out there, and when you get to picking the right tool, of course, you've got to go and do your own benchmarking. Then we'll move on to networking. Now, networking is a huge topic. I actually was a network engineer in a previous life, so it's something I know well. So we'll talk about some of the key concepts around there. We'll talk about how networking feeds into zero trust architecture. Then we'll talk about security capabilities. So again, the kind of capabilities that you need in a network for security, but we're not going to be talking about specific brands or anything, because that's not the point of what we're doing here. And then we'll finish off, if I haven't already answered your questions, we'll finish off with another Q&A. So as I said, I will keep a look at the questions as we go. If I don't answer them, I will get to them at the end. But as I said, we are live. I'm doing this live. So please talk to me and I will try and answer the questions as we go. So let's kick off. So first of all, what do we mean by identity and access management, which we often shorten to IAM? This is probably one of the part of security that you may or may not realize you are the most familiar with. I'm sure at least today, at least this week, if not today, within the last few hours, you have logged into something. I know I have. I know it depends where you are in the world, but it's only 9:30 in the morning here in Melbourne, and I have already logged into several things. And that is doing that. Logging in is identifying yourself and using IAM. So, in principle, what it is about identifying someone and making sure they get access to the right things, or do not get access to things they are not supposed to. So generally, IAM means that you have an identity. So in the bullet points here, we say digital identity. And then that identity is tied to certain access rights. So when you identify yourself as that person or individual or entity, then within the INAM system, it will look up your role and say, okay, Sarah has access to the Microsoft files, but she does not have access to, say, the Microsoft top secret files because she's not that important. Something like that. So I don't think I need to explain too much why that ties into security. I think it's fairly obvious in that we want to restrict access to the right people and the right things that they need access to, whether that's a file, whether it's using a particular program within your environment, or whether it's even logging into your environment. Because, think of your workplace or where you study. Not everybody should have access. If they don't study at your institution, if they don't work at your workplace, they probably shouldn't have access to any of your files. So this is a really, really fundamental concept. Now, we'll dig into a little bit about what that is. But first of all, there's two things you'll hear all the time. We have auth. It is often abbreviated to auth, but auth actually means two things. We have authentication and we have authorization, and you need both of those to happen when you're doing identity. So authentication confirms a user is who they say they are. And then authorization is about making sure the user has permission to complete the action they're trying to do. So really straightforward example here. I'm sure you've all got a phone of some description. And either I use my face to log into my phone nowadays. But first of all, looking at my face is identifying who I am. So that's authenticating. Am I Sarah? And then in the back end, when I say log into my banking app, they will be, if I'm trying to transfer money around, they will check that I actually have permission to do that. A lot of the time you'll hear security people just talk about auth as one thing, but it is actually two separate things. So let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. So as I say, authentication is verifying who someone is. Or who someone or something is. It's also important to remember that an identity doesn't just have to be a person. An identity can be, say, a machine. So if you've got an application that runs and has to request things within your system, that application will have an identity. To be more topical at the moment, we could talk about AI. So an AI agent or an AI application that will have an identity, and then so it will, throughout your environment, it will say, hey, I am this particular program, this AI app, this is who I am, so I want to do this thing, am I allowed to do it? So how do we verify who someone is or who something is? Now, you will know this. Even if you don't realize you know this. So authentication methods, we try to use more than one, but there's three types: something you know, something you have, something you are. So we generally like to have two of these. And that's what we talk about when we say two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, is that we're using two of these, two of the three at least. And that's because, of course, say it's something you know. The most obvious one here is a password or a PIN. If someone learns that, or if you write it down on a sticky note, which hopefully you don't, but we know people do, that can be disclosed, and then someone else can use it and log in as you, pretend to be you. Whereas if we have two of these factors, so if it's a password and your face, for example, then it's a lot harder for you to steal someone's password and get, and spoof their face. Now, I'm not saying that there are ways of getting around some of these or cheating the system, but if you've got two-factor, it's quite unlikely you're going to be able to do that. Then the last one is something you have. So you may have a token or something that you plug in. It might be a YubiKey, something like that. So we say nowadays it's really essential that you have two of those things for authentication, not just one, because one could be bypassed. So, or someone might be able to get through it. So you need two. And we actually say research shows that something crazy like 95% of attacks would be mitigated, or initial breaches, we should say, when someone initially gets into a system, just by having two-factor authentication. So when you log into a website or your bank or whatever it is, and it asks you for like a pin or a code or whatever, something additional, don't be annoyed, because it's actually a really good thing to make sure that we definitely do have the right person. Okay, next up, authorization. So authorization is where we grant or deny permissions to something. So if you think, again, say where you study, your work environment, you don't just open the door and let everybody look at everything. That would be horrible. That would be a mess. Let's take Microsoft here. I'm sure that within Microsoft there will be there is somewhere a system in our payroll that stores how much everyone gets paid. Now that is something that most Microsoft employees, apart from payroll, should not be looking at. And so just because I have access to Microsoft's environment does not mean I have access to everything within Microsoft's environment. And that's where authorization comes in. So we say, okay, we know who you are. We know that you're part of this organization, but then it's okay, what do you actually have permissions to? And that's the authorization. Now, how we do that is usually through rules and profiles, and I'll talk a bit about it later. But it's about saying what can someone do when they are inside the system. And hello everybody who said hello in the chat. Hello, Louis, Lucas, Gigi. Hello, all of you, and Tudor. Hello. Good to have you with us. Now, this is a really important one. Before we move on to some of the architecture stuff, something called the principle of least privilege. Now, this is not a new concept. This has been around for a really, 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 really long time. Now, unfortunately, the principle of least privilege is really hard to do. Essentially, what it means is when you are granting someone or something rights to a system, they should have the absolute bare minimum privileges they need to be able to do their job. And that can be really difficult to work out, especially in complicated enterprise systems. There can be lots of different systems and layers of permissions. So when people are building, sometimes they just get overwhelmed and they'll say, hey, do you know what? Stuff this. I'm just going to give them access to everything because it's easy. But the reason we don't want to do that is because then if someone breaches an identity, hacks your account, gets into it, and your account has access to everything, that means that, the potential damage that attacker could use with your account is much higher. So I talked about this last week about lowering risk. So the principle of least privilege is all about lowering risk. Like, we know that systems get attacked and identities get breached, but the less privilege they have, the less potential blast radius could happen. So, that someone who's got, say, global admin can do a lot more damage. A user account that has global admin can do lots more damage than a user account that only has access to a tiny proportion of files. So that's how we always say you never give an identity, whether it's a person or a machine, any more privilege than it needs to do the job it's intended to do. But in reality, this is very difficult to do. And that is why lots of folks don't do it, or they don't do it very well. And it's not a one-time thing. You need to be constantly reassessing because people change jobs, system architectures change. You have to reassess these privileges. So it can be very difficult to manage, like really, really difficult. So it's what we try. It's our North Star, our best case scenario, but getting to the principle of least privilege is in reality very hard, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Right. Let's look at zero trust architecture. Now, this is a little bit of a recap on last week. So, because we did talk about zero trust, and zero trust is a lot about identity. So I'm kind of going to repeat myself a little bit here. But anyway, for those of you who weren't here last week or missed this bit, zero trust is the modern way we build IT systems. So rather than having everything in one big box in a data center like we've got on the left there, where we basically look at where somebody is coming from the internal network, because now we have things in cloud, we have people bring their own devices, people are working from home. We can't verify we can't verify who someone is reliably by just looking at where they come from and looking if they're in the corporate network. So instead, as it says there on the right, we go to this who are you, not where are you coming from. And so that's why we need that authentication and authorization piece. And every time someone tries to access something, we say, actually, who are you? Are you allowed access to this? And we keep verifying that. So that's why we use identity, as we say now. Used to be network is the perimeter, but now we say identity is the perimeter. So it's really, really important that we get this identity piece right. And of course, if tying this back to the principle of least privilege, if we do not, if you just give access to everything and don't do the principle of least privilege, what that means is that we're not constantly verifying who someone is, and it doesn't align with zero trust. So yeah, that's kind of what we're doing there. And as I was saying, zero trust, fundamental principle, we don't trust anything. And every time someone tries to access something, we have to re-verify who they are. We say, hey, who are you? Who are you? And do you need access? And does the system say you have access to this? And then, of course, we've got all the multi-factor, etc. So identity and zero trust are very, very closely tied together there. Right, capabilities. This is a biggie. So as I was saying, when I mean capabilities, what I mean is the kind of capability within the identity space. I am not going to talk about a specific tool, whether one is better or worse. Having said that, just to illustrate what I mean, I might throw out some names that you know. So for a start, I talked about multi-factor authentication. So authentication is something you know, something you have, something you are. So for example, you can have YubiKeys, you can pins and passwords, you can use Face ID, whatever that happens to be. Again, different vendors do this in different ways. You can have fingerprints. Some of you may have a laptop with a fingerprint scanner. That's becoming less common, but that's a thing as well. So there's all kinds of multi-factor authentication out there that we use to make someone really prove who they are. Now in Microsoft land, multi-factor authentication ties Entra, or the product formerly known as Azure Active Directory, has various different types of multi-factor authentication, but it also integrates with third-party ones as well, because there's no point having some that work with our system and not others. Now, single sign-on. This is, again, probably, if you're not familiar with the phrase, you've definitely used single sign-on, even if you haven't realized it. So single sign-on is where you sign on in a particular place. You might sign into a portal or a browser, and then it sort of carries that. No, that's not what I wanted to say. Single sign-on is basically where you log in and everything uses the same login, and it's one identity store. So a perfect example here, because examples help, is M365. So when you log into different parts of Microsoft and Azure, you're always using the same sign-on, because all of that sign-on is a single sign-on that is behind the scenes Azure Active Directory or Entra, but it could be any directory service. And single sign-on is designed to try and reduce the friction. So it allows you access to multiple applications and systems just with a single set of credentials. And when I say credentials, I mean your username and password and other ways of identifying who you are. And the reason we do this is to improve user experience, and it reduces the risk of managing multiple passwords. Now, you might say to me, and this would be a reasonable question, well, Sarah, isn't it good to have multiple passwords, because we say don't use the same username and password? And you're correct, but and this one can be a hard one to explain. We do recommend that you don't have multiple identity stores. So it used to be that you would, and it still is the case, that you'll have logins in lots of different places. You'll be logging in here, you'll be logging in there, etc. And these are all different identity stores. Whereas in an enterprise environment, ideally what we want to do is integrate everything into one identity store like Entra. And so, because it's much easier to protect one single store of credentials. Tudor, yes, single sign-on is recommended from a security standpoint. Absolutely. It's a good it's a better user experience as well, but reducing the number of credentials. If you have a load of credentials in one system and another system and all over the place, each of those different identity stores we have to secure, and that's actually harder than just putting all our resources into securing really well one identity store. But to mitigate the risk of, because some people would say, oh, well, if you only have one set of credentials, then if that's breached, they can get into everything. And that's a fair point. So to reduce that risk, what we say is you need to be using multi-factor authentication, and there's other tooling I'll talk about later. So we reduce the risk of those credentials being breached. But all the research shows that it is much safer to have a single centralized identity store as best you can. It's not possible for absolutely everything, and try and keep that secure. So I know that can be kind of a weird one to get your head around, because it sort of seems counterintuitive to some of the advice that we're given, but that is definitely the recommended thing. So role-based access control. Role-based access control, or RBAC as we call it, this is how we give out access. So, I was saying with the authorization, we have to control what permissions people have to different things. But that's really hard to do. You can't, it's not scalable to sit there and go, oh, Sarah is going to have XYZ and I don't know, Bill is going to have ABC, and do it one by one. It's not practical. It doesn't scale, and it's not manageable. So instead we have like profiles that have certain sets of permissions. And within Entra, there's loads and loads, there's hundreds of pre-configured profiles. So you don't have to do that yourself. You can, but you don't have to. Right, adaptive authentication. This is now, again, if you're using Entra, you have probably inadvertently come across this, even if you didn't realize what it was. Adaptive authentication is quite new in sort of the timeline of identity. And essentially what it means is when you log into something, it will have a look at how you're logging in, when you're logging in, what device you're logging in from, what country you're logging in from, if it's available through the sort of the rough IP location. And it will compare that to all your previous logons and be like, hey, does this fit a pattern? Does this fit a pattern? And does it look like some of their other logins that they've done before? Because and if it doesn't look like a typical login, then there are rules in adaptive authentication where you can say, hey, if this login looks atypical and unusual, we will ask them to completely re-authenticate themselves. Now, we have this in Entra and we use it in Microsoft. I'll give you an example. So when I log into my machine, generally it knows that I am me. I log in from the same machine in roughly the same location. And so it just sort of lets me in. I went on a holiday to Nepal, not a place I travel to at all. And Entra looked at my login and was like, hey, she doesn't normally log in from Nepal. That's not where she is normally. And so because I was flagged as like an atypical login, it actually asked me to completely re-authenticate myself. I had to use my authenticator on my phone to prove I really was who I said I was. Because when you get a login with different attributes, it could be, now it wasn't in my case, but it could be that that's actually a breached account. And so then the adaptive authentication, like the brain, we call it conditional access, by the way, in Microsoft land, it will say, hey, I need to double check this person is who they say they are. I'm going to make them go through the entire thing again, because then I'm happy. Like I'm going to do additional authentication steps to make sure this really is the real person. So the idea being, if that had been an attacker who'd managed to breach my account, the theory being that if they'd been asked for more authentication, they probably wouldn't have been able to provide it, and that would have protected my account. Right, biometric. This is just, well, it is, but I'm sure probably most of you know, biometric is just using things that you are. So it could be face scan, retina scan, fingerprints, voice patterns. Apparently, I've never seen this one myself, but apparently they've even got typing speed as one. for identifying who you are. But I've never seen that one myself, I have to say. And then privileged access management. Privileged access management is so, I was talking before about the principle of least privilege and people needing, people need the right level of access to do their jobs, but they shouldn't have any more than that, because if an account were to be breached, it would increase the range that the attacker had, and we don't want that. Now, privileged access management is a way of it is a way of managing that. So say I was an admin and I did need like a really high admin level every now and again to be able to do some certain admin work. But I don't need that every day for just when I'm sitting here doing a live stream. So privileged access management allows, it is a tool, is a capability in identity that allows you to temporarily grant someone additional privileges to do something, and then it takes it away again. And again, the idea is that the less access someone has, the less likely they are, if they're breached, for it to go badly wrong. Oh God, I've been through there's so much to talk about here. And then this sounds really boring, but it's actually really important. Identity governance and administration is where look, I'm sure everybody here has started a job or signed on at a college or something. And then when you leave, your account gets deprovisioned. I've been through several jobs. Now, identity governance and administration is about managing that, because we do see if your account isn't got rid of when you leave the company, it's open to attack, and we shouldn't have dead user accounts. So identity governance and administration tools help make sure you get rid of accounts that aren't needed anymore. I know in one of my previous jobs, we used to do, before we had tooling for this, we used to have to do it manually, which wasn't very fun. And I did this with a colleague of mine, and we found some dead people in our system because they had not been removed. So go figure. That was a long time that some accounts had been there that didn't need to be. And I will say that there have been real life cases of accounts that of people who have left the company, or of applications that have been decommissioned, that have subsequently then been involved in breaches because people forgot about them. They weren't secured properly. They weren't upgraded when other things were upgraded. And so it is definitely something that needs to be managed well. And then last but not least is behavioral analytics. This kind of ties into your adaptive authentication. When someone's using a system, behavioral analytics tooling will have a look at, what's this person doing? Is what they normally do? Is this unusual? So, for me, my normal pattern of behavior at Microsoft would be Sarah logs in from home, sometimes from other places I work. I usually go on, look at my emails, look at my Teams, look at whatever else it is. But if I logged on, say, from a different place, from a completely different country that I don't often visit, and rather than going on my Teams and my emails, I started trying, asking Copilot to pull me a load of files, that could be me just doing a particular job, but it could be an attacker who's breached my account and tried to extract things. So that's why looking at how accounts behave and getting an idea of what's typical and what isn't is really important. Now, of course, we do have to balance that with people's privacy. So and that can be tricky, but you'll probably notice whenever you log on to a work or some kind of commercial system, generally when you sign a user agreement or your contract, it will say, you allow us to not invade your privacy and look at exactly what you're doing, what you're typing, but to monitor your behavior. And this is why we do that, at least from a security perspective. It's that understanding typical account behavior is really important, because something atypical could be a security issue. Right, last thing to talk about, because this is the most important thing, maybe I should have had this slide first, is a directory service. Now, a directory service is crucial in a modern IT environment. This is the core of your identity and access management stuff. Basically, a directory service is where you store your credentials. It facilitates access to the resources. It has the access policies, and it's all in one place. So the most well-known one, of course, is Active Directory. Obviously, Active Directory used to be on-premise. Now we have Azure Active Directory, which is in the cloud, but now its name has recently changed to Entra or Entra, however you want to say it. And these things are really important. Like you will not find an enterprise environment without a directory service. So, directory services will validate user credentials. When you log in, you are logging into the directory service. Your credentials go to the directory service. The directory service decides if you are who you say you are based on your other factors of authentication, whether you put in your PIN, your password, etc. That is the tool at the back end that's making that decision. And it will then also in a directory services where you configure what access people have. So, rather than saying Sarah has access to everything Microsoft, they'll say, hey, Sarah needs access to not very much, actually, only the things in Australia, for example. And group management is where you sort of group users into logical groups. So, you might have the Australian people, you might have the people in the US. There's lots of different ways that organizations choose to group users. It's not always by geographic location, can be by business unit. We don't have a strict, hard and fast way of advising you do that, as long as it's logical for that business. Of course, a directory service is what supports single sign-on, because, of course, single sign-on is where you're using the same credentials, and so those credentials are always stored in the same place. So you definitely can't do single sign-on without a directory service. And as I said, that's where you manage all your users, because it's a central store. Also, in terms of a bigger security picture, and this is what we'll talk about in a later episode, directory services keep a log of who's logged in, who's logged out, what they've done, and that's important to go up into security monitoring. So those logs that they generate will go into a bigger security picture. Now I'm going to take a breath for a moment, see if we have any questions before we questions about identity before we move on to network. And I'm just going to take a mouthful of Coke, so don't mind me. It's too much talking. Right. Seems like everyone's quiet, so that means I must have explained it amazingly well or terribly, one of the two. So, let's keep going. So, IP addressing, again, one of those things that you have definitely come across, and I'm sure everybody here has at least heard of IP addressing. So, IP addressing stands for Internet Protocol Addressing. It's basically a label that's assigned to everything that's connected to the internet. There are two versions of IP addressing, IPv4 and IPv6. Now, you are likely more familiar with IPv4. That's been around a lot longer and is still largely more in use than IPv6. But fun fact, we've run out of IPv4 addresses. We actually ran out quite some time ago, because when IPv4 was created, quite a while back, I think in the 80s, they didn't imagine that we would need so many addresses and that so many things would be connected to the internet. What we've done to get around that IPv4 addressing problem is a couple of tricks, which I won't go into, but it's called network address translation and port address translation. And it's a way of reusing IP addresses without them clashing. Because obviously it's important. You can't have on the same network segment two devices with the same IP address, because the network doesn't know where to send the traffic. That is not something to go into today, but look up network address translation and port address translation, or NAT and PAT, if you want to read more about it. But it's amazing. We've actually managed to extend the life of IPv4 far beyond what we probably should have done. But we are starting to see IPv6 creep in. As you can see, just by looking at the different addresses there, you can see that IPv6 is in use, is much longer. And so we have, I can't remember the maths off the top of my head. You'll have to look it up. But there's like millions, billions more addresses in IP version 6. So it's going to take us a lot longer to run out. Yes, Moses, I'm going to say Moises, hopefully, or Moses, not 100% sure how you say your name, so apologies. IP version 6 is in use. It is not widely in use, and it is also, but it is definitely being used. Probably in your more public facing stuff, you will still see version 4 way more than version 6, but certainly internet service providers and their backbones and certain large networks that are a bit more advanced are certainly using IP version 6. But just if you're looking at like your home network and your home router, it's all IP version 4 still. So go and have a look. Though you'll notice that, most operating systems now are all ready for IP version 6. They're set up, ready to go, but it's going to be a slow transition over. And certainly within an enterprise work environment, changing from IP version 4 to IP version 6 is not a small job. So it will take a while. Now, this is something I actually learned about at school. I'm not sure that's normal, but anyway. The OSI model. This is the OSI model is really important in networking. This shows you the different layers within a network, and the 7 layers, as you can see. I'll go from bottom to top. So there's media and host. The first one at the bottom is the physical. So that's literally the physical bit of the network, because all networks have a physical element to them, a cable, whatever. There's the data link, which is the frames, the actual framing of the transport. Like I said, I'm going to explain this very high level. It's very logical, and I love the OSI model. The network side of things is where it does the flow control and starts determining like how you're going to send things. Transport is where, again, it starts to do the acknowledgement, which we're going to talk about number 4 a bit more in a second. Session is building up the sessions between the 2 endpoints. Gigi, TCP IP 5-layer model. I'm not sure that's the same thing. I've never heard of that. But TCP IP, I actually don't know what that is. I've never heard of that ever, and I've been a network engineer for about 15 years. Because OSI is the general sort of industry standard. That could be, I'm wondering if you're talking about possibly TCP handshake, maybe by another name rather than OSI, because TCP IP, I don't know actually. But yeah, I've not heard of that. Interesting. And then up in the sort of, this is higher up. So basically we're breaking down from the very physical layer of the network all the way up to where we deliver the traffic to the application. It has to go through several layers before it gets there. So you can't just take like the 1s and 0s in the physical link, because literally when it gets to literally when it's in the physical layer, that's literally like 1s and 0s, it's bits, and then we have to reassemble it into something an application can use. Again, this is a very high level explanation. Okay, there's a bit of a debate in the chat about this TCP IP. I am not heard of that, and that's surprising because, like I said, I actually was a network engineer before I did security, unless that's a new thing that's come in or a new thing to explain it. Although we can't go into this in a ton of detail, there's at the layer 3-4, we have 2 transport layer protocols. Again, you will have probably seen TCP and UDP thrown out there. It's important these are the main ways we shift data around the internet. It's worth understanding what these 2 are and why. Well, all internet traffic really uses one of these. Most internet traffic uses one of these, but it's important to understand the difference. So TCP is more connection oriented. TCP does a handshake. So when you're using TCP, the other end, you will send a handshake to it saying, hey, I'm here. Are you there? It will send an acknowledgement back. We will handshake. And they'll say, okay, I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to send you information this way. Are you okay with that? And it'll say yes. When everyone's in agreement, start sending data. And data is sequenced, so it has numbers. So if the remote end doesn't receive a number, if it gets like 1, 2, 5, 6, it will say, hey, I missed 3 and 4. Can you send it to me? And that's how we make sure we get all the data. Having said that, because of that additional overhead of this handshake and talking, TCP is slower and it's heavier. We say heavier, which is what it says there, because there's more overhead in actually setting up a TCP connection and keeping it ongoing, because it's always doing that error checking. Whereas UDP, which is user datagram protocol, that basically it gets the far end, the IP address, and it just sends it. So it's not checking whether the other end is receiving it. It's not doing sequencing. It does like super basic error checking, but it's very lightweight. So the difference is, and the fact is we need both of these. So if you're doing something like streaming, your streaming will be in UDP. Something where you cannot drop data and it's important that you receive everything in a sequence, that would be TCP. Whereas streaming, if you drop a few packets, it's not going to break your stream. So what we use really depends on what application is being used. So that's it's just, again, a networking concept that's important to kind of be aware of at that transport layer. But everything is encapsulated in one of these two types of packets, depending on the particular traffic. Now, port numbers. You've probably seen, if you've probably, I'm almost certain you will have seen a port number mentioned somewhere near an IP address. Now, port numbers are how we differentiate different services or applications. So you can read them here, but we've got well-known ports 0 to 1023. So standard services, standard protocols that we use on the internet, that we use in networks, have a fixed port number. So HTTP web traffic or unencrypted web traffic is an 80. HTTPS, which is what you should mostly be using nowadays, is 443. FTP there is port 21. Now, it's worth saying you actually can change these ports, but these are the standard ports. A network, a security solution back in the day was to change the port number to hide the service. Now, that is not a good way of doing security, and it's we don't recommend that anymore, but it used to be a thing that, say, your FTP is on port 21. So FTP is file transfer protocol. That's where you can pull files from a file server with, or you can push files to a file server. Now, FTP, you could change it to port 25. You could change it to port whatever, the dynamic ports there. You could change it to, 491.152. And then people would say, oh, now it's secure because the hackers won't be looking for my FTP on port 21. It is really easy to find ports, services, and what port number they're running on. There's loads of scanning tools that do it. But in terms of understanding networking, you need to understand that because when the traffic hits a particular device, it says, the network will say that the TCP or UDP packet will say this is for 192.168.0.1, whatever it is. But then it needs to know what port it's going to so the application can pick it up, because when it hits the device is like, what? Okay, I know this traffic's for me, but what service do I pass it to? And that's why we need port numbers. So it goes without saying that the device that you're sending from needs to be using the same port number as the device you're sending to. And that's why we have those well-known port numbers for the, very, very typically used services in IT. However, you can change them, but things start to break if you don't do it right. So again, something to be aware of. Port numbers are sort of key networking concept. And last thing, encryption. We talked about encryption in terms of the CIA triad last week, but encryption is the way that we we basically use a key to convert data into a format that can't be read unless you also have the key. Now, you'll hear a lot in security about talking about network encryption at rest and encryption in transit. So it's important to do both of these. So when you, in transit, of course, is when you're sending data from one place to another. So we want it to be encrypted whilst it travels. because if it's not encrypted whilst it travels across the internet or across a network, then it could be intercepted. Now, that's something that I'm sure all of you here have seen adverts for the VPN providers. There are many of them. You see them on YouTube and in other places. And they will say, use a VPN because this VPN will protect your traffic from being intercepted. That is true to an extent, but if you're already using an encryption protocol, so like HTTPS rather than HTTP, it's not really necessary to use a VPN as well. I am simplifying that a little bit, but it's a good example because I'm sure all of you have seen a VPN vendor advert somewhere. And a VPN does provide encryption in transit, although you don't usually have to do that anymore with modern systems. Now, encryption at rest is when data is stored somewhere. So if it's stored in your OneDrive, in a SharePoint, so where it's not traveling anywhere, but it's just sat on a system, we also need to encrypt then as well, because the encryption at rest and encryption in transit is done in two different ways, which I'm not going to go into just for time, but they need to be done in different ways. So when data arrives at the destination and it's unencrypted by the device that has the key, when it's being stored, it needs to be re-encrypted another way to sit on a OneDrive, a SharePoint, whatever it is. Now, the great thing is that if you're using cloud and you're using cloud storage services, pretty much almost always your cloud provider is taking taking care of that for you. Some industries will require you to do it yourself. There are certain industry verticals, some government top secret things where you have to do your own encryption, even if the cloud provider can offer it. But in general, encryption at rest will probably be done by your cloud service, but you do need to check that. Right, zero trust architecture. Now, previously talked about how networking was networking in zero trust architecture is not the main way we do it, anymore, because we're not looking at where you come from, which is correct. However, there is some important concepts. It's not that network security has gone away entirely. There's still important things we have to do. So one of the main ones is network segmentation. So we still want to divide our network up into smaller bits because, again, when the segments are isolated, it makes it harder if your environment is breached for someone to move. We say it's moving laterally throughout your environment. So if you think of the castle and the moat analogy again, it used to be that we would have a castle with a moat and big walls, but if the attackers got through those big walls and the moat and all our perimeter defenses, they could just run amok inside the castle and kill everybody or whatever. Whereas what we're going for now is like lots of small little well, if you think of the castle thing, you may know castles sometimes would have keeps and like have another mini castle within inside the castle. So if it was breached, there would be another load of walls they had to get through. And that's kind of what we're going for with network segmentation, is making each little part of the network its own segment and protected so that if the whole environment is breached, it's just harder for attackers to keep moving around and they don't have free reign. Now, how we do network segmentation really depends. There's not a fixed recommended practice that you segment everything by location or line of business or whatever. Again, it's one of those ones that really depends on the individual organization and what makes sense. So you might have all the devices in Australia, you might have all the devices in the US that are in a network segment, or it might be that you have all the HR applications and things together, all the sales stuff. Again, there's not like an industry standard on that. It sort of depends what works. But it is really important. And on this picture here, this is just one I borrowed from Microsoft documentation. But you can see here, we have virtual networks around different parts of a region to break them up a bit. So there's a SQL server and there's some virtual machines. So they're probably an application each. And we want to segment them because they don't need to talk to each other. And they and again, if one of those applications was breached, they've still got to go through the virtual network. And if you're familiar with old school networking and VLANs, virtual networks are sort of fairly similar. Don't take that like not identical, but very similar idea. Now I talked about end-to-end encryption. Well, I talked about encryption, but just to again, how it fits into zero trust is that we need end-to-end encryption. So before I was saying we have encryption in transit and at rest, putting those together makes end-to-end encryption. So that when we talk to one thing and we send it data and it stores it, the whole piece is end-to-end encrypted, so it can't be intercepted. That's pretty much it. So again, I think I covered it mostly before, but if you hear the phrase end-to-end encryption, that's what it's talking about. It's that every bit of the transport journey and the storage at either end is encrypted, which is important because if it's not encrypted, anything not encrypted is way more vulnerable to being intercepted and used. So last thing I'll talk about in terms of like a zero trust thing, this is you hear this phrase thrown about a bit. I don't want to sort of labor it because we're doing fundamentals here, so it's not the biggest issue in the world, but something called SASE. I call it SASE. You can pronounce that however you want, but SASE stands for Secure Access Service Edge. It's an architecture that it's a cloud-based thing. It's not just one tool. Generally, it's usually an amalgamation of tools that allows you to segment things, identify things, and it's really important to help support zero trust. Like I said, I don't want to go into this too much, but it's just it is like an architecture type that basically says if you want to come and access anything anything within our environment, we have this edge. We call it the edge of the service, and in order to get into that, we're going to authenticate you and make sure you are who you say you are, etc. And the edge sort of covers every single resource. So if you want a new resource that you didn't request before, you're going to have to ask for it again and let it reassess whether you're allowed it. So it is basically kind of a productization a bit of zero trust. Don't worry about it too much, but it is something that gets thrown out a bit. So it's worth just briefly mentioning what it is. Okay. Last up, let's talk about some of the tooling. Again, we're not really talking about brands here. We're just talking about tools that you need in the network in terms of security. So one that no doubt you have heard of is firewalls. There are different types of firewalls. We have the traditional firewalls. Traditional firewalls work at layer 3 and 4 of the OSI model that we talked about before. So they are looking at blocking traffic or blocking or allowing traffic depending on the IP address and the port number. So you will say something like, hey, you can allow traffic from this range of IP addresses and on this port number, but block everything else. So they're doing that blocking there. And that's probably what, if you know about firewalls, that's what you think of. The next one is a web application firewall. Now, although it's called a firewall because it blocks things and allows things, it works at a completely different layer. It is up at the application layer, so layer 7 of the OSI model. So it's not looking at IP addresses and port numbers. A web application firewall very specifically looks at web traffic, so stuff that's being carried on HTTP and HTTPS, and it's looking for web-based attacks. Now, I did mention some of these last week in the threats. So these firewalls are designed to protect web applications. So any kind of attack that's web application specific is what they will be looking for. So things like SQL injection and cross-site scripting. So they will have a look at the HTTP traffic coming. If it looks like it's some kind of attack, they will block it. Web application firewalls are really important for web apps. You must not put a web application on the internet without a web application firewall in front of it. It is a very bad idea. And then last one that kind of goes in here is a cloud security group. So security groups are what I was talking about previously, the network segmentation. That's how you do that network segmentation in the cloud. Now, different cloud providers call them different names. We call them network security groups or NSGs in Azure, but they all fundamentally sort of do the same thing. So you need to use those to segment your network and yeah, depending on what they're called in the cloud that you're using. Next up is the content delivery network. And again, you've used one of these, even if you don't realize it. We usually just call them CDNs. So If I have a website here in Australia, but you're accessing it from the US, for example, that's obviously got a little bit of a way to travel in terms of the internet. Now, I know we're still talking like milliseconds here, but in networking terms, it's a while. So a content delivery network is a global network that basically allows delivery of network traffic, like particularly websites closer to where the person is requesting it. So if I had a content delivery network, rather than and you requested to see my website from the US, rather than it coming straight from my web server in Australia, the content delivery network would actually serve my website to you, one of its local servers in the US, to make it quicker, and it improves performance and availability. And for big global websites, it's really important to have a CDN. We also have a CDN within Azure as well. So if you're building things in Azure, you can do that. Load balancers sort of does what it says on the tin. It balances traffic across multiple servers. And of course, the reason we want to do that is to make sure availability is good and you get a good performance. That's kind of, they do what they say on the tin, load balancers. And of course, from a security perspective, availability is important. Now, Bastion hosts, I actually know these by a different name. It depends where you are in the world. Bastion hosts are also known as jump boxes. The idea with a Bastion host or jump box is that you can use that to go and access your servers or your devices. Now, and I've just seen Robbie's question about, are Bastion hosts anymore with zero trust? Yes, but there's a yes, but. So a Bastion host is okay from a zero trust perspective, but you need to build it so it has access to a Bastion host should not just have access to everything in your environment. Your Bastion host should really align with your different network segmentation. So you shouldn't have a Bastion host that can just get to everything in your environment, because of course, if your Bastion host was compromised, then the attacker can get to everything. So in a zero trust perspective, you would have a Bastion host in each sort of network segment. And so it wouldn't have access to everything. Now, having said that, ideally, in an ideal environment, you would not have a Bastion host at all. But this is not realistic for most environments. But I'll tell you what, ideally, you would have. You wouldn't have a Bastion host at all. We would use just a DevOps pipeline. And we call it infrastructure as code. And this is a bit of a hole that I don't have time to go down. But ideally, what you would do is have no Bastion host, and that every time you needed to make a change to your environment, you would push it down a DevOps pipeline and push some code and a template to change your environment. Now, that requires more work. It's quite a mature way of doing IT. And most organizations don't get away from using Bastion hosts, but certainly you shouldn't just have a Bastion host that is configured to get at everything. And they are targets of attack because generally they are configured to look at everything because it's easier to do that. So attackers do know to look for Bastion hosts, which is why it's very important that they are well secured. In Azure, we have something called Azure Bastion, which is actually a hosted Bastion host server. And you can tear it up and pull it down again like other cloud services. So it doesn't have to be there all the time, which again is a way of reducing attack surface. But yeah, I'd love to get rid of Bastion host, but that's probably not realistic, at least not yet. And then the last couple of things, I already talked about VPNs actually, but VPNs, with zero trust, VPNs should go away, actually. So the idea is with a VPN, it creates a tunnel between your device and another device. And then you're essentially on the same network. Before, and VPNs are used extensively in the past. I'm sure there are at least some of you tuning in who, for their employer, would have to VPN into your work's environment. And then it would appear to the network like you were coming from your business's network, even if you were at home. Now, with zero trust, that goes away, because it doesn't matter in zero trust, it doesn't matter where you are coming from, because we're going to authenticate who you are in a different way. And so if you get to a true zero trust networking architecture, you don't need VPNs anymore, and VPNs can just go away. And certainly we are getting to that, but for most organizations, that's a journey. You can't just turn off VPNs. It takes a while. But certainly, if someone gets to a true 100% zero trust architecture, you would not need a VPN. But, I don't think they're going away anytime soon. And then last thing, we talked about this as an attack last week, but DDoS protection. So DDoS is distributed denial of service. There's various different methods for doing a DDoS, but essentially, if you do a DDoS attack against an IT environment, the idea is that you stop it being able to function and service requests, so it doesn't work anymore. Now, there is specific tools out there that you can put in front of environments that if they see traffic that looks like it's a DDoS, they will block it before it gets to your environment and does it some damage and stops it responding. Most Azure has built-in DDoS protection tooling. There are also third-party ones you can buy as well. But certainly, if you're an organization that does stuff on the web, you need some kind of DDoS protection, because DDoS attacks are everywhere. The majority of them are foiled, as long as you have good protection. But I'll tell you, I have a friend who used to work for one of the government security response teams in this part of the world, and the most common attack that they saw with the everyday public, this wasn't just businesses, was DDoS. You may or may not be aware that you can buy basic DDoS attack tooling for a couple of dollars online. And we're not talking about the dark web. You can just find it. Teenagers DDoS each other in Fortnite and things like that to take them out so they can stop playing, so they can win. That's a true story. So, DDoS is very, very accessible. You don't need a lot of skills to do it. So it's definitely important that you have that tooling to be able to do it. Oh, well, that was a big one. I realize I'm sort of up for time. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but feel free to throw some in just before we wrap up. But hopefully that has been, I'll give it like 30 seconds, because I know we're just going over time, to see if anyone's got any last questions. But if not, I'll say join me next week. Obviously, this will be on record as well if you tuned in late. We will be covering more things in the next few weeks. So join me if you want to learn some more security basics. And hopefully, you found this interesting, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone, for joining. Thanks, Sarah, for another awesome session. Our session is a part of a series. To register for future shows and watch past episodes on demand, you can follow the link on the screen or in the chat. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. If you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear what you have to say. You can find that link on the screen or in the chat. And we will see you at the next one.